if I actually need this. I'm just gonna try to not use it, but if anyone has difficulty hearing me at any point, just holler and I will switch this darn thing back on.
What did you say?
I know who to keep an eye on, who's going to keep me on my toes this evening. As John mentioned, I'm Anna McHugh. I live in Raleigh, and I've been into wild mushroom hunting for a very long time. This is my the conclusion of my 17th wild mushroom season. I will caveat that by, I started this hobby when I was on the West Coast, and when I moved to Raleigh in 2013, I spent a good bit of time being completely obstinate about the fact that I had to start over with a lot of my learning, because there are a lot of mushrooms that are quite similar, but actually different species on the East and the West Coast. That said, this has been a passion and a hobby of mine for a really long time. I've always been kind of an outdoorsy kid. That's me. As you can see, very little has changed. And when I sort of started to discover wild mushrooms in the woods, it was a really amazing experience for me, because I was raised in the woods, and the first time I saw a chicken in the woods as an adult, I was like, holy shit. How have I gone like 30 years of my life without actually ever noticing this in the habitats that are so important to me? And so that was a moment where it's like, I am deeply curious. I want to observe nature from a far more, basically slow it down a little bit and look at things in a smaller scale. And also to become familiar with wild mushrooms that I can eat. Some people in the community will be like, well, if you're into eating wild mushrooms or foraging is your objective, then you're not committed, and I think that's nonsense. Most people who start mushroom hunting start out because they want to eat them, and if they end up falling down the mycology rabbit hole, that's something that happens afterward. But I want to give you a quick sense of what we're going to talk about today. So this is going to be a quick overview of mushroom biology, morphology, what you're going to be looking for, some tips for how to be successful with mushroom foraging, but also with learning and acquiring new knowledge. Because if you're like me, the idea of going out into North Carolina Piedmont, especially in the height of our season, so say July, and collecting every mushroom species you see and bringing it home and identifying it, or even using the internet to identify it, totally not rational behavior. You're just going to become frustrated. And so I have a few recommendations for how to sort of iteratively learn, become very, very comfortable with things, and also by the time you get to some of the more suspicious characters you've been ignoring for a while, you've already seen them time and time again. So it's a lot easier to encode and create categories to help accelerate your learning. But I want to basically preface this by saying that I am a mushroom botherer. I will never call myself a mycologist, because I study and do information classification and taxonomy in a totally different world, in a totally different sense. So for me, this is really about getting out in nature, observing and learning, and building a scaffold of information for myself so that I can recall the names of these species. But to me, it's not trivia to learn the scientific names. It obviously helps me understand relationships between the organisms, but it is more a touchstone for me to go back into the resources every time I find something and find out what we've learned that is new. Because every time mushroom season rolls around, I realize that some of my knowledge has gotten stale. Some of the names have changed, some of the names have been split, especially when we're talking about places in North Carolina, which are so very vibrant and diverse. And to that point, I want to point out one of the mushrooms you're going to see throughout the course of the winter time. There are hundreds of species in this genus. This is called the Russula genus, also known generically as brittle gills, but you'll usually hear people call them russulas. They are brittle. They're oftentimes, they have white gills underneath. They have a white stem. Sometimes, in this case, they'll have like a little bit of flushing of color. Many of them are bright red or purple. Some of them are green. Again, hundreds of species, and many of them are in this red-pink color scheme. And if anyone tells you that they can identify a red russula to species, they are absolutely lying to you, because most of them are not named. And so the more expert you talk to, like I roomed with a Russula expert at a mushroom foray one time, and I said, so how are we doing with the red Russulas? And she laughed and walked out of the room. So suffice it to say, not only am I willing to set a cap on my own ambitions, there is a cap on how well we will ever be able to classify the mushrooms we find, especially if we're out in the field, and this is more about passion and interaction with nature, as it often is. Speaking of, this is how I got involved with, becoming finally disciplined with my East Coast mushrooms. So when COVID came, I did not get on board with any of the routine COVID hobbies. I tried to make some bread, it was terrible. So I was like, wait a minute, I'm going to actually go back into the forest that I've been visiting for my chanterelles, for my beloved hedgehog mushrooms, which are my favorite edible mushroom, and I'm going to start learning some of these species more specifically and kind of dive back into that aspect of it. And that also led me to making a lot of videos, because I realized it was really a lot of fun to basically reinforce my own learning by ensuring that I can explain something, because that's one of the ways that I can determine whether or not I actually understand something. Whether or not I remember it or remember it correctly, to the point of me being like, 6 months is the ideal window for shiitake logs. Totally inaccurate, 6 weeks, 2 weeks, whatever it is. However, being able to return to these places and look at mushrooms from a more, I guess, developing a relationship with them over time has been really valuable to me. All right, so let's get into the actual content, things you may find to be helpful that I can share with you today. First of all, I want to talk about morphology. And a lot of people who will introduce sort of mycology and mushrooms, they'll start with what is the mushroom's lifestyle, what is it growing on, what is its ecology and habitat. We're going to cover that. But if you are just out in the woods, like stumbling around looking at mushrooms for the first time, understanding what different fruiting bodies kind of look like is going to give you a very good sense of essentially where to start flailing around to find good information. And to that point, we have a couple of different sort of mega categories to pay attention to. The first one, and the most numerous, also the most interesting but challenging, are your gilled mushrooms. If you're not familiar with the word gills, all that means are those deep blade-like structures that are underneath the cap of a mushroom. Many, many, many thousands of them. So like that is an area where if you see a gilled mushroom, you're into it sort of opens up a massive book of options for you. You also have bolete type mushrooms, and we're going to see some of those in a few minutes. Those have sort of a spongy undersurface and a porous layer. It almost like when you bisect it, it almost looks like baleen in a whale, essentially, is how I think of it, like these little tubes, and that's where the spores come from. You also have polypores, so these are mushrooms oftentimes in brackets. Many of them are very woody, and you're going to see them throughout the wintertime, and they have sort of a very fine porous undersurface that is different from that like spongy undersurface. That can get a little confusing because people call them both pores, but they look quite different. Then you have false gilled mushrooms, meaning mushrooms that look like they have gills, but they're not really gills, they're more like wrinkles or some sort of overlay. And then you have all kinds of other unusual things. This is a mushroom I highly recommend that you get to know if you're interested in edibles. This is a crown-tipped coral mushroom. The scientific name for this one is Artemisia pyxidatus, and that basically means a boxed crown, essentially. So if you look at this mushroom, there are a lot of different mushrooms that look like coral on our forest floors. But very, very few of them actually grow on wood, which Artemisia does. So this genus, it looks like a coral. There are many other corals that you will find, but it is growing on wood, so it's consuming wood. And then it has these adorable little, like, 3 or 4 pronged boxes at the very, very top and the tip of the fruiting body itself. And so that is a really, really good distinctive feature. And I highlight this one because even though it looks like many hundreds of other edible, by the way, like the things that it look like, the worst that can happen to you is you'll eat one and it will make your belly feel very, very bad for a night or two. But the combination of what it grows on, being wood, that very distinctive pattern at the tips and the terminus of the fruiting body, and then also sort of the manifestation of it in its color is really distinctive. So that's a good example of you can get into the area of coral mushrooms and get lost very, very fast, but if you're interested in I want to find 1 or 2 good edible ones, this is one of my favorite edible mushrooms in the North Carolina Piedmont. It's really good. It's also really easy to get an identification verified. And that's another thing that is really important to me when I'm acquiring new mushroom species that I want to eat, is I find and identify something a couple of times, but I also verify my IDs, and I only eat a small portion of a well-cooked sample of that mushroom species, and I can get into all the reasons why later with some very graphic icons about why. So we've talked about those fruiting body types, and I'm going to cover what those different components of them look like. Now we're going to talk about habit and habitat, and when I say habit, I mean sort of the lifestyle of the mushroom and what it consumes. Not the mushroom, excuse me, the mycelium. If you're not terribly familiar, mushrooms are simply the fruiting body, the biological expression of the fungal body. Mycelium is a massive, typically network of cells underneath or growing through the wood or soil, other organic material, essentially exuding all kinds of enzymes and consuming all kinds of different organic material through that network. So these different lifestyles are essentially how that mycelial mat feeds itself. And if you are familiar with sort of our giant classification of organisms, you may have heard that fungi are more closely related to the animal kingdom than they are to plants. The reason for that is that they cannot source their own food. They have no chloroplasts, no photosynthetic sugars. They are like us. They need to find their food from somewhere. And so you have a couple of different sort of primary lifestyles and ways that mushrooms achieve this. And you will see that behavior, like that habit, that lifestyle reflected in the way that the mushrooms show up. So first of all, you have your saprobes or your decomposers. Your classic ones you're going to want to look out for all winter long, especially on New Year's. I don't know why, but we have big old oyster mushrooms on New Year's, it seems, in the North Carolina Piedmont every year. So you'll oftentimes find these growing on wood, and there are a lot of different species of decomposers. But if you find a mushroom that is growing directly on wood, that is a really good indication that that is the whole area you want to look in. And again, in the spirit of like cleaving off huge sections of your mushroom book you don't want to look at anymore, if it is growing on wood, you can be like, okay, all of my symbiotic ground-growing mushrooms, I don't even have to look at that part of the book anymore. So, and that's a fairly small group relative to our parasites and our mycorrhizal mutualists. So we have parasitic mushrooms. One of these right here is one that is a classic edible that you'll find a lot in North Carolina. It is the honey mushroom, the Armillaria malea group. We also have ringless honey mushrooms, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but they are extremely parasitic to trees and to plants. And so they essentially will strangle and steal all the photosynthetic sugars and also decompose and just completely destroy their hosts eventually. Then the mushrooms that most mushroom hunters are the most interested in are your mycorrhizal or your mutualistic species. So these are mushrooms that come back year after year because they partner with a buddy, like a tree or a plant partner. So the tree provides that photosynthetic sugar, it's all wonderful, and then the mycelium attaches itself to the root system of that tree, and it provides essentially access to a lot of moisture. But by way of moisture and groundwater, you also get minerals, you get a variety of other things that are helpful to the tree. And so your classic, this sort of edible mycorrhizal mushroom in the North Carolina Piedmont is the chanterelle. This is one of the reasons you can go to a chanterelle patch year after year after year, and it will go on for like indefinitely. And that's another thing that's really interesting about our mycorrhizal species. And a lot of these mushrooms, with the exception of your decomposers, if they're sourcing their food from something that is consistent, we don't actually know how long-lived a lot of these organisms are. And so some of them are estimated to be in the thousands of years, which is very reassuring and also interesting to me. All right, and then you also have weird cryptic blended lifestyles. And what I mean by that is, for instance, we have this honey mushroom, which is parasitized by a mycorrhizal mushroom called Entoloma abortivum. Entelomas, it's a little genus that makes these little hat-shaped mushrooms. A lot of people aren't all that interested in them scientifically. But the mycelium of one of them attacks honey mushrooms and turns it into this wonderful and delicious thing called shrimp of the woods, or the shrimp mushroom. So you have this like parasitic mushroom that is being attacked by a mycorrhizal mushroom that parasitizes it and makes it edible. So you have a lot of weird stuff when it comes to these lifestyles. But the TLDR here is like, if it's growing on wood, you want to look at your decomposers. If it is growing on the ground, you want to look at your mutualists. And then you have parasitic things kind of happening in between. All right, so I want to talk very briefly about your odds of coming to harm when you are wild mushroom hunting. So We have fewer than 3 fatalities a year. Usually it's a lot less than that. So like if I tallied up the numbers from 99 to 2016 in the United States, it's about 1.5. So we really have a very, very low rate of fatalities. One of the reasons for that is that the mortality rate for the most toxic mushrooms in North America is very low. So it's less than 10% of people who present to the hospital with death cap poisoning or deadly Gallurina poisoning. Those are kind of the 2 like big baddies that you have to be mindful of. With supportive care in the United States, most people make a recovery. That said, when I say recovery, I don't necessarily mean a full recovery. These poisoning events can do a lot of damage, especially to your liver, but also to your kidneys. It is definitely something to be avoided. However, when I am interacting with my friends in the naturalist community, I worry so much more about plant foragers than I do about mushroom foragers. Because most mushrooms are innocuous and they don't taste very good, but they won't really bother you. They may pass through a little bit faster than you would like. But oftentimes plant people are like, well, it is totally deadly toxic unless you boil it 3 times on the hunter's moon, and then you strain it, and then you add 3 quarts of vinegar, and then let it sit for a month, and then you have to blanch it and parboil it again, and then it is mostly safe, except some people are sensitive. Now, that may reflect like a lot of hyperbole on my part, but at the same time, when I'm talking to people about mushroom safety, what I really want to reinforce are not so much poisoning yourself, but not getting lost, because that's actually the most, I think, risky thing. And when you look in under the covers of like the mushroom news that goes around North America every year, when we lose people, it is more often than not someone goes out in the woods by themselves, oftentimes in the Pacific Northwest, but it can happen here just as readily because of how thick and dense our forests can be, and they're never heard from again. And so it's very, very important that if you are like me and you do like to go out solo, first of all, people know where you are. I actually really enjoy, and this is probably a hunting type of territory that y'all can take advantage of as well, is around a lot of our reservoirs. We have Wildlife Resources Commission land. And so it's like a little strip between the lake and then somebody's house or something like that. And so it's like, technically, it is not a state park, so I'm allowed to collect there. I do have to be mindful of hunters. I have to wear my blaze orange, but I'm also like screaming distance from a $5 million house over there. And so that's how I sort of handle that balance of like, I want to go out by myself, so I'm going to go to some place that is legal and also like quasi-park-like. But if you're gonna go out like really wilding, like the buckhorn wild game lands that y'all have nearby, I would definitely take a buddy with you. A couple other recommendations around the subject of not getting lost. Download offline maps. It's super easy if you go onto Google Maps or whatever application you have, and you can just zoom out and download a ton of maps, and that's helpful. I also recommend All Trails. It's an application that will do like step-by-step tracking for you when you are out in the woods, and that has occasionally just saved me time and anxiety. And a lot of this is like, you're not gonna die. Like I reinforce this getting lost thing because it's happened not just to a lot of my friends, but also to me. So quick story time. I was on the coast of Northern California with my friends. I could see the Pacific Ocean from where we were. I didn't have a timepiece, and so I asked my friends, does anyone have like a spare watch and something like that? And my buddy Don said, oh, you're in luck. I have a spare Garmin GPS unit. You're good, you're golden. I'm like, fantastic, off I go. I get about a third of a mile like turned around because it was a wonderful mushroom day. I was like, no big deal, I have a GPS. Had no idea how to use it. And I'm like, well, that's very useful. And then I'm like, well, I guess I could probably navigate by the largest landmark on Earth, the Pacific Ocean. No dice there because I didn't actually write down or remember the name of the place where we parked. Because I was so close to home, I ended up getting back before my friends even realized that I was late. But I was half an hour late, and I had images in my mind of like, airlifts, and shame, mushroom shame, no end. So, staying on track is always helpful. Another thing, if you're an iPhone user, 14 Pro and above has satellite SOS text messaging. So anywhere you have satellite access, you can get a message out to emergency services. And that is something that like actually made me upgrade my phone, because now I'm like, sweet, I can actually reach emergency services almost anywhere I go. All right, other things as far as getting your stuff identified and being successful with mushroom foraging or mushroom hunting. If you're going to work with other people or log your observations on iNaturalist, or God help you, on a Facebook group somewhere, take pictures from multiple angles. And that's helpful because, like, a good example would be if you get a picture of the top of somebody's head and they say, is that Bob or is that Matt? And I'd be like, I have no idea if that's Bob or Matt. They both have brown hair. I get a lot of mushroom requests that are similar to that. Even worse are my coworkers who are like, I have a brown thing in my yard, and I think it might be a mushroom or a piece of poop. Can you help? I'm like, let's start with photographs. So to give yourself a head start, and this is also a lot of fun for me. This is when I started to actually learn a lot more about these different parts of mushrooms, is when I started to sit and take them apart and take photographs that were, like taking my time taking photos, honestly, was a big unlock for me. You can also, one of the things that I find to be very successful with not only pattern recognition, but also just general success, is if you're on a hillside, look up the hill, not down the hill, because mushrooms will pop up through the duff and you'll start to see little mushroom shapes, and not just looking for mushroom colors, or even worse, what people call mushrooms, which are just sort of like those little humps of usually pine straw that you kick it over, and it's like, is that a mushroom or is that something else? So up the hill has done me really good over the course of time. Also, if you are basically it doesn't matter which way you prefer to harvest your mushrooms. You can pluck your mushrooms and then trim them off at the base, or you can trim them off at the base like when you collect them. For me, I am very fastidious. I clean my mushrooms like crazy in the field because I've spent too many hours cleaning dirty chanterelles at home, and that's very difficult compared to when they're super duper fresh. But we have about, I've got a link here and I'll share the presentation, but there are 2 longitudinal studies on the differences between plucking mushrooms and cutting mushrooms, and there really is no difference in future yields. The main thing that seems to dictate what's going to happen with that patch, there are 2 studies that are 30 years apiece, it seems to be rain. And so, ultimately there's some ambiguity about which is the most responsible harvesting method, and the data indicates that either is fine. The real thing is to be mindful of the habitat that you're in, and if there's litter, maybe bring in a moop bag with you, pack out a little bit of other people's trash if you feel like it. Of course, make sure your keys, contact info, and critters are secure as well. All right, so let's talk about taxonomy, because this is an elephant in the room for a lot of people who are interested in wild mushroom identification. You get very enthusiastic, you learn to identify a few things, and then you start to realize that even a regional field guide is going to send you to like a whole bunch of links on the internet that are 2 years old, and then the names no longer work because there is a lot of emerging knowledge all the time. That's one of the things I love about mycology, is it is one of the few areas in science where I'm like literally 6 months and things can change really radically. That can make it very daunting to build a structured knowledge base for yourself. And so with me, I try to identify my mushrooms to genus if I can. If I can't get to genus, I go a little bit higher into those morphology and lifestyle categories that I was just talking about, and sometimes up into the family level and orders and so forth. But if you can get your head around sort of the gestalt, the shape, the presentation of a lot of our genera, that will give you categories that will help you start to recognize things. That doesn't mean you'll necessarily recognize things correctly, like I still mistake things from one genus for another, but that is a very good way to like break it down to a layer where then if a species is even available, you can get to it eventually. And when I say if there even is one available, just to give you a sense of reference, the North American Mycological Association had their annual foray in Black Mountain in 2023. There had been no rain for like 2.5 weeks, so the conditions were very, very dry. It was kind of like people were a little bit grumpy, and we collected 535 species over the course of 2.5 days. That was record-breaking. So certainly when it comes to North Carolina and our diversity, but also the number of species that haven't been rigorously studied, you'll have a lot of things that they're like, well, this is a species group. You'll see that a lot, species group, which is like, we think it's this, but there's probably 4 or 5 things that look like it. But you know, they change names all the time. I just don't worry about it too much because I just go back, and one way, if you're like me and you're like, I don't worry about it, but I kind of want to have the right name, here's what I would do to also get into sort of the scientific classification and also build out a library and knowledge base that you can easily get access to. So first of all, if you are brand spanking new and you're trying to figure out what books and resources to get, I highly recommend regional field guides, not field guides, for instance, that cover all of North America, or even, you know, even something that is like the Eastern United States, I think would be really difficult to use, because the regional field guides, as you can expect, curate those species for you. And that's very helpful because even though, you know, it is ideal to sit down and go through a dichotomous key, don't know what that is, it's just paired statements that help you narrow something down. So it's like, if it is bright red with yellow guttation, this is my favorite mushroom of all time, then go to, you know, it's like a choose your own adventure, go to statement number 7, or if it is not that way, go to statement number 3. That is a really good way sort of to historically like go through and identify a mushroom, but regional field guides, they'll give you keys so you can get practice with that, but those keys are only to the things that like live in your area, so you can get practice with using that tool, but also only be focusing on things that you would reasonably expect to see. Mushroom Expert is a wonderful website. It also has a lot of keys on it. It is a amateur and passion project, so sometimes the keys are unfinished or the names are out of date, because it is one guy who is an English teacher who has committed himself also to some of the best and most rigorous mycology information on the web. It won't tell you anything about edibility. He was just like, you know what, I'm not going to do that part, I'm going to focus on the other stuff. But as far as like websites online for Mushroom ID, Mushroom Expert is indispensable. Friendly online forums, I'm not going to say which ones are friendly and which ones aren't, but if you wander into a mushroom Facebook group and people start giving you the heavy about not using scientific names, there are places that are a little more laid back. Let's just leave it there. Another place that is really helpful for me is iNaturalist. Now, there's a lot of folks who will take everything they take a picture of and they load it to iNaturalist and they have a list of things that they've identified. I am not one of those people. I use iNaturalist to compare my mushroom with other people's observations, because when people upload to iNaturalist, you have a number of nerds who will go through and validate IDs. So if you're going to use iNaturalist to compare a collection, what you want to do is search for, you know, what you may think you have. And also iNaturalist has reasonably good OCR, so if you upload a photograph, it will suggest some species for you sometimes. They're not always great. But then there's a filter box that is research grade, and you want to check that. It is not by default, but it is in there, and it is great, because then you will see a list of validated IDs for the mushrooms. And that's really helpful as well, because often mushrooms look very mutable throughout the course of their lifespan. This is my favorite one. They keep changing the name. It was Exudoporus frostii. It is Exudoporus frostii. It was Butryrhyncholetus frostii for a minute. I call it the red wrinkled flabbergaster. I don't recommend that you necessarily invent your own common names, but at the same time, I have been given permission to use that because I so very much love this mushroom, and it's so very unusual and exclusive to the eastern US, and one that you will find in our pine forests in the summertime. So, and as you can see, it just has a lot of very unusual features, from extreme what is called reticulation, so it's like an interlocking sort of oversurface on the stem, to a really distinctive white ring around the outside of a very bright red cap. So, but this is an older specimen, younger specimen. You can see the colors are quite different, and you also have different color staining patterns. So like iNaturalist is really helpful for saying, okay, I want to see a mushroom in a wide variety of states of development. All right, so let's talk about some of my favorite wild mushrooms. We're also going to cover some of the edibility recommendations, but also the different parts of a mushroom if you're not familiar with how to start to like observe the different pieces of a mushroom. I am going to qualify here, I am not good at cooking. And like all culinary preferences with mushrooms are wildly subjective, I submit that they should be rated by what I call the Hot Pocket scale. And the Hot Pocket scale is if a mushroom is more satisfying than a Hot Pocket, specifically my preferred pepperoni pizza Hot Pocket. If it is more satisfying than that, then it can come home with me. If it is less satisfying than that, then I can leave it for somebody else, be it wildlife or another human being who prefers it. I did a talk at the Alabama Mushroom Festival last weekend, and it occurred to me that I hadn't had a Hot Pocket in excess of like a decade. And so I was like, I wonder if that metric still holds up now that I'm a little more health conscious than I was. Turns out it's still very, very accurate. Hot Pockets are still very, very like mediocre good, I would say. And so they're a good benchmark for me for wild mushrooms. All right, so I'm going to talk about a few different species. I have a guide here for the different sort of categories, and this is where a lot of the conversations on mushroom forums fall apart. Is you're a beginner or someone like me, and you go and you're like, this is a really cool thing, can I eat it? And then you get all kinds of cryptic responses about whether or not you can eat it. And then someone might say something like, any mushroom can be eaten once, and then there will be a lot of angry reacts. As you can see, I don't spend a lot of time on mushroom Facebook anymore. That said, it can be very helpful. But the reason for that is that there's a lot of different definitions for edible, and there's a lot of different, like, again, tolerance and interest in mushrooms. So I categorize them as so. First of all, you have mushrooms that when someone comes and says, is this edible, what they mean is this edible and actually better than a Hot Pocket? And so that is what I put in the edible and tasty category. Then the thing that gets really, that I think makes those conversations really difficult are the tons of mushrooms that are inedible because they are woody or corky. A really good example would be your turkey tail mushrooms. You can use them to make tea. They have a lot of different applications. But if you were to like fry it up in a pan, you'd be like, this isn't edible, and I mean it's edible in the sense that like a wool sock could be consumed, maybe not great. So inedible, edible, and tasty. Then the vast majority of mushrooms fall into this wide category of like edible, but I don't prefer it. There's a lot of people who do like mushrooms that I think don't taste like very much. And then you have your variety of toxic and also sensitivities. So first of all, you have mushrooms where some people have problems with them and will be like, oh yeah, that mushroom's fine, except I get farts like crazy. For us, there is a one chanterelle species that is not allowed in my house anymore. It's a smooth chanterelle, but we won't talk about that. My partner apparently is like, cool, that's the one for me. So you know, there are some that are a little bit like that. We also have some where there's people who tend to be more sensitive to it on a more consistent basis, and then mushrooms that are known to cause extreme GI upset but no lasting damage, and then finally potentially deadly mushrooms. So you have, even within the like highly toxic, what you would see in a book, we have a difference between like sick for a day or possibly shut your liver down. That's why those conversations fall apart so often. All right, so let's talk about very, very dangerous guild mushrooms that we want to be mindful of in the North Carolina Piedmont. I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to show you the different parts of the mushroom if you're interested in identifying, especially guild mushrooms. So this is the Amanita genus. If you're not familiar, just spend a little bit of time, like read up on the basic features of Amanita. There are many hundreds of them. They're also so diverse and wonderful in the Piedmont that you will find the name refreshes on Amanitas are lightning fast, and there are 2 people in Burlington who make it worse. God bless them. They are wonderful amanitologists, but they are going to make my life difficult in the next few years. All right, so the ones that you want to be extremely careful about are destroying angel mushrooms. So this is probably the most toxic sort of classic cap and stem mushroom we have in the eastern US. There are several species, we're not exactly sure how many, but the estimate is anywhere between 4 and 6. And the ones that are the most common that you'll find in the Piedmont, and this is throughout the summertime, you may see a few of them still hanging around, is Amanita bispora gira. And so this is the most common of the destroying angels, but you have some others that are larger and a little bit more, I think their features are a little neater, and I'll get into that in a second. But essentially what you want to be mindful of are mushrooms that are white, all over. White gills underneath, as you can see. They have a white cap, and it also, unlike a lot of amanita mushrooms and other mushrooms, it is featureless. So like amanitas, a lot of them have warts, or they have streaks, or they have stains, all kinds of different stuff. But your destroying angels, they're white and they're matte. Sometimes they can be a little bit sticky when they're wet, but it is a very beautiful but very plain looking mushroom. With Amanita bisporagira, you're gonna find it also, it's kind of like tall and slender. These specimens are probably about yay big. And so as you can see, they're very tall and skinny. They also have what's called, and all destroying angels, with the exception of one, have what's called a partial veil. So that's this ring on the stem here. So what happens is you have essentially a protective layer of tissue that covers the little baby mushroom. When it pops open, it leaves a ring on the stem of some kind or another. In the case of Amanita bisporagira and your other destroying angels, that is a really beautiful white ring. Some are larger, and this one, it is unidentified, but it could be one of a couple of different destroying angel species. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of yellowing that happens as they get old and dry. So when I say they're white all over, it's like white and occasionally tinges of yellow where they've dried out, especially as you can see, like right around this partial veil, because it's very thin. It's very membranous too. So there's a lot of these partial veils that like you touch them and they'll fall right off. Fortunately, with your destroying angels, they're thin and they're frail, but they don't come off very easily, which is really nice for IDs. Finally, and most importantly, with all mushroom identification, you want to collect the entire specimen, reason being what's going on at the base of your Amanita mushrooms and some other genera, but specifically Amanita, is very, very important. So I talked about this partial veil, this little protective layer of tissue. You also have what's called a universal veil. So it's either a cup of tissue at the base, sometimes it's a big bulb. Some of them, like we have some Amanitas that smell like a peed-in pool, that's like a giant carrot-looking thing. So at the base, you can have a wide variety of structures. In the case if you're really poisonous destroying angels, it is very much like a cup of separate tissue that is distinct from the actual stem. In the case of Amanita bisporagira, unfortunately, that cup is very messy, so you have to be very cautious when you collect it. But, and when I say messy, I mean it sticks to it a little bit, it can fall apart fairly easily. So again, if you're trying to get an ID, you do need to, like pluck the whole thing and clean up the base as well. So, but those are also the main things that you want to look at when you're looking at a gilled mushroom. It's like, what is the color of the gills? What is the color of the cap? Do I have any features on the cap? Do I have a ring on the stem or not? A lot of mushrooms don't. What do I have going on the stem? In the case of like this mushroom, there isn't much in the way of features, but there's some that do. And then also what's happening at the base. Sometimes spore printing is helpful. I very, very rarely do it, but occasionally it can be helpful. In the same way that sometimes the flavor is important with identifying mushrooms, very frequently is not. Like I usually rely on my senses, like in the smell, touch, and sight department. But these are sort of the key things to look for as far as your morphology. Let's talk about another really famous and delicious Amanita mushroom. So Amanita in general is not a very good genus to start with as a beginner genus for the reasons I just shared. Like we have some very poisonous ones, but most of them are not poisonous. Some of them are highly psychoactive, and then we also have a lot of them that are edible. So this is the Caesar mushroom, Amanita jacksonii, or the slender American Caesar, probably one of our most iconic summertime mushrooms. You may see a couple of them again. Like this year has been so weird, you probably won't see a lot more mushrooms just because it's been so dry, but hope burns in my heart forever because I'm starting to have what I call PMSD, which is post-mushroom season disgruntlement. And in the interest of like keeping my family and friends happy, I'm like, well, we could see some more Caesar mushrooms this year. You never know. But these mushrooms share some of those really classic Amanita-like features. So again, you have a partial ring on the stem. This one's way more fragile. When I was talking about ones that you can touch and they fall off, trying to get a good picture of mature Amanita jacksonii is very difficult for just that reason. So it has a big sort of beautiful flamenco-like skirt, but it will fall off very easily. Also on the cap, you can see it is, instead of being featureless, it is highly featured with what is called striation. They're stripy grooves that basically run around the margin of the cap, and you also have a variegation in the color between sort of a bright, sunny yellow to orange into this really beautiful crimson, sort of like, it goes from light to dark typically, and you also tend to have in the center where it is the darkest red, what is called a little umbo, so it's like a little red nipple in the middle. When they are in their best condition for consumption, however, they're far, far younger. So the gills of this mushroom, also unlike a lot of amanitas, they're yellow. That is very distinctive, and they have, it's a little hard to see here, but these are essentially like a floofy layer of orange tissue over a yellow stem. And that, there's a much better image of it. So they often form up in little spikes or chevrons, what you'll see in guidebooks, often is the word used to describe it. And that is the probably most distinctive way to tell that you have Amanita jacksonii compared to the other Caesar amanitas, which are all known to be edible, but if you want to get academic about it, you want to be looking for something that has this orange ornamentation on the stem and also this red color pattern, because those are the two things that make it that, as opposed to one of the others, like the sunburst amanita and Mary Banning's amanita. There's a whole bunch of them, and they're gorgeous. But to conclude, so the ones that you want to focus on from an edibility perspective, they're much, much younger, and you have a partial, or excuse me, a universal veil, so this big cup of tissue at the base. I love the shape that it takes because it's like this big leathery goose egg, and it often splits just perfectly, so you have some very like aesthetically pleasing Caesar amanitas. And as you can see, I've opened it up, and you'll see on the inside, like this is an extremely distinct piece of tissue. The part you want to go, like if you're interested in eating this mushroom, you want to go for the cap when it is nice and closed up, when these gills are nice and tightly packed together, and you don't want to bother with that leathery goose egg at the base. Even if you could clean it off, you probably wouldn't enjoy eating it very much. This is also one of the few wild mushrooms that you can consume raw. Very, very popular with the ancient Romans. Like there's European species of this, and a lot of fun, Roman history revolving around Romans poisoning each other with mushrooms that were this, but dressed up to look like that. But as far as also mushrooms that you will see so frequently that you can really dial in what an amanita is, I would focus on these Caesar amanitas, and then I would focus on these destroying angels, because that gives you the full range of both edibility and desirability, but also some of these features that are so important, especially in colors and caps and all that fun stuff. All right, let's talk about your chicken of the woods mushrooms. This is one of those that is, if you're just getting started and you're trying to pick the first 5 wild mushrooms to pick, this would be one of them, I would say. It is a polypore mushroom, meaning it has a fine porous layer underneath. It's a little hard to see in this photograph, but the pores are so small, you oftentimes have to like get a little hand lens or get really up close to it to tell that there are holes in there at all. This is the most common of several chicken of the woods species that we have that grow in North Carolina. Laetiporus cincinnatus is the name of it. Some people call it the white chicken mushroom. I don't call it that because there's another thing that's called the white chicken mushroom, and I'm just going to not do that until they decide what they're going to do as a common name. But it is really distinctive from your other chicken of the woods mushrooms because it has this beautiful sort of orangey peach color. A lot of your other chicken of the woods are like bright pumpkin orange, like orange, whereas these are more like pinky orange. And then they have a white undersurface, whereas your other chicken of the woods species is more like a lemony yellow. And then additionally, and probably most noticeably, your other chicken of the woods mushrooms tend to grow in shelves on wood. And this is a decomposing species. This is a butt rot fungus. But Laetiporus cincinnatus, you will usually find growing in rosettes, actually at the base of trees. And so the habitats where I find these are like, go to parks where there are grandfather oaks, and you'll find them oftentimes at the base of trees in these very distinct rosettes. I also want to highlight, even though this is a very easy mushroom to identify, it can take on very off flavors very rapidly. So if you collect one of these and you cook it, and you don't think, oh my God, this is amazingly like chicken, but you think this is a little like chicken, but a little chemically, you missed it. And they have a very, very short window. And it won't harm you if it is not great, but once they start to get a little bit fibrous, they tend to take on some pretty unpleasant flavors. This is also a mushroom that a lot of people are sensitive to. When I say sensitive, you get kind of a variety of reactions. Some folks just get like generically the barfs and the poops from them. Some folks have weird stuff like anaphylactic reactions, and they'll get like, you know, swollen lips and things. But nobody, to my knowledge, is that like there hasn't been a deadly toxicity event from Latiparus, but it is kind of weird that there are a lot of people that are sensitive to it. But also, because it's so easy to identify, there's a lot of people that eat it. So we have a lot of data about the variety of reactions that people have to it. All right, so I want to talk about chanterelles briefly. This is, you know, sort of the best part of my summer is June 9th is when I consider Raleigh's chanterelle season. That's typically when I assume that it is going to start, usually within a few days of that. Oh, and to my point, actually, since we are at the end of the season, Latiparus cincinnatus is the first mushroom that I am looking out for to tell me that the next season is about to start. And so we have morel season here. It's a lie, at least in my world it's a lie. I have one tulip poplar that produces one morchella diminutiva every 3 to 5 years. And my morel season consists of like going out back, walking this far and saying, it's not there this year. And then I go, and I wait until I see this in usually mid-May, and then I'm like, okay, we're just a couple of weeks out from chanterelles, and then beyond that, we're just a couple of weeks from the boletes. So this is kind of my indicator species that a lot of things are waking up for the summer season. And sometimes you'll see people be really surprised when they see this mushroom so early in the season. This species will fruit multiple times in the same place per year. It doesn't always happen, but I've got a couple of spots where I can reliably find it in May, and then again, often in like September or so. So, and even though it's a decomposer, they'll come back year after year because they typically are growing on big trees. All right, so on to our chanterelles. This is the Cantharellus genus. We have a lot of them in North Carolina, and they are a little bit cryptic, a little bit hard to tell apart, but fortunately, it is one of those things where if you can identify a Cantharellus mushroom down to genus, you are fine. Also, with one exception, the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, the mushrooms that you would consider lookalikes for chanterelles are not particularly problematic. Jack-o'-lanterns look radically different if you set them side by side, primarily in color. So these sort of golden chanterelles that you see right here, that's about as dark a gold sort of egg yolky color that you'll see in the golden chanterelles that you'll find in the North Carolina Piedmont. Your jack-o'-lantern mushrooms, they are really, really pumpkiny orange, and they also grow in these big bouquets and they grow on wood. But they do occasionally cause people problems because they can make you feel really ill. And they share a feature with chanterelles which is called occurrence. So chanterelles have false gills. I talked about this at the very beginning. So these look a little bit like deep blade-like structures, but when you start to handle them, you'll see that they're actually more forked wrinkles. And this can be a real problem in the Piedmont because a lot of our chanterelles, they don't look very forked. They don't look very wrinkly. And so if you look at a chanterelle from the Pacific Northwest, it's just this big, hoary, wrinkly thing. And some of the mushrooms that we see here that are chanterelles are, they look much, much more like classic gills. But if you start to fiddle around with them, you'll find that that is a very superficial layer of fertile tissue that's over the top that is wrinkled, and then there's like a consistent sort of covering. So that it comes off very, very easily. They're not separate structures. Also, and most, basically the easiest way to identify a chanterelle is, you know, besides some of the color things, you open it up and if it's nice and white and firm on the inside like string cheese, that's what you have. The mushrooms that look like chanterelles do not have that feature. Sometimes you'll have a fruity smell, and not always. And I mention that because there are a lot of field guides that say chanterelles smell like apricots. A lot of ours, they have a slightly fruity smell. My favorite, and also probably the most numerous of our chanterelle species, is Cantharellus velutinus, or the velvety chanterelle. So we have a peach version of this, and we have a golden version of this, and they're very, very numerous, and they grow in just gangbusters in you know, any sort of medium, like medium-aged oak forest around here. And they do sometimes have an aroma. They sometimes stain brown when you harvest them, so you can like collect them and get them home and think that they are spoiled by the following morning because they've turned brown. That is just oxidization, and it's like, well, it's similar to what would happen with your, with an apple or something. But also they have an aroma sometimes. It's almost like artificial juicy fruit. And so it's like, it's weird because it's like, it's fruity, but it's not apricots, and it's almost rubbery and it's almost artificial. So I guess what I'm saying is that, the aroma can vary greatly, the appearance can vary greatly. While you're out in chanterelle patches, you should always look for hedgehog mushrooms. This is my favorite genus of mushrooms to find and to eat. They have a really delightful flavor. They're also very robust, so you can cook the heck out of them and they won't fall apart on you, and that's a big problem for me, but they also impart a lot of flavor for, relative to the number of mushrooms you gather. And that's helpful because like you can go to a chanterelle patch and you just look around for chanterelles that look a little bit sort of white and that basically look like they are sun bleached, and flip them over and they may in fact be hedgehogs, and they have little teeth underneath. So this is actually more closely related to your chanterelles than any of your other sort of toothy mushrooms, but this is the fertile surface. The teeth are really, really delicate, and so like if you flip it over and it starts to fall apart, just don't worry about it. Like you're probably not going to be able to, like if a hedgehog mushroom is going to shed its teeth on you, there's not a whole lot you can do, but it won't ruin anything about like the cooking experience. Anyway, so they have these little teeth underneath. They oftentimes also are a little bit like rumply and indeterminate in the same way that chanterelles are. So they don't look, kind of like a nice little bloop, like cap and stem. They're much more waffly. To me, they look like little scoops of homemade vanilla ice cream oftentimes. And also, a lot of them that we see here are in a subgenus that's called subgenus alba, which means white. And so they're very, very white colored. Some of them are almost like fluffy and like a little furry, but many of them stain orange throughout their, this one is a very common one you'll find in the summer, and I took a photograph within a couple of seconds of handling it, and you can see the orange staining coming in already. Some of them, that staining is a lot more brown and it's a lot more slow. And I mention this both because our chanterelles and our hedgehog mushrooms have a tendency to look really not great the following morning, and they're totally fine. It is just again, a staining reaction. A lot of this is beta carotene, to my understanding. All right, so we do, speaking of off-season mushrooms, around the new year, I do oftentimes find a few of some of the 17 odd hedgehog species. Hydnum vagabondum is my favorite. It's about this big. They're much, much more brown, but you will find them in the winter time. They're just different species. All right, let's talk about the ringless honey mushroom really quickly. This is one that you're going to hear about your family and friends from if they learn that you are interested in mushrooms. They are highly parasitic, and they also go off like a bomb in usually September. Kind of depends on the weather, but it's almost like someone fired a starter's pistol, and then all of a sudden, like these big, bouquets of ringless honey mushrooms come up. They are edible. Some people, it doesn't agree with them very much. Parboiling is recommended just for that reason. And to my understanding, it's more other honey mushrooms that cause people problems, but just sort of generically, people are like, be cautious about honey mushrooms because some people, they're very fibrous, and some people, it makes them feel a little bit icky. Not dangerous level, but icky, and I try to avoid that. So, edible with caution. You'll find them growing at the base of host trees, but you'll also find them growing in yards on like trees they have already killed. And I say that because I have a few trees that they have already killed, and they will come back year after year and just consume the rest of what's there, and will go on to kill everything else. They're a really problematic organism. They also have what are called those decurrent gills, so gills that run down the stem just a little bit. They start out pale, and then they start to get sort of greasy brown as they mature. Also in the center, they're not honey colored, but they're sort of a light brown. These have a little bit of a splash of a honey color, but this is more of a, it's almost like furry or finely hairy. And that's another reason that I don't tend to eat this mushroom is I don't like things that are hairy. And so if something is like, it has little hairs on it, I'm like, I'm gonna pass. But some people really like these, and some people really like, especially the stems, as I mentioned, are very fibrous, and a lot of people really like them in soup. And so they do have a good flavor, a good crunch, but they're not my thing. All right, so I am going to conclude, I think this is a conclusion, with a mushroom that you will see very commonly as well in yards. I also included it because I would be remiss if I didn't use this icon. Like, somebody put this icon on the internet and open sourced it, and like I would be remiss if I didn't use it at every opportunity I can. But this is also a mushroom that is toxic, not deadly, and is the cause of most of our toxicity events, or the lion's share of people who show up at the hospital barfing like crazy is because they ate a green spored parasol mushroom. First of all, because they're very conspicuous, so you'll find them growing in big rings and arcs in yards. Also because they look like parasol mushrooms in the Macrolepiata genus, and there are some parasol mushrooms that are really, really delicious, and also very, very beloved by a lot of folks who immigrated to the United States. And so this is oftentimes a mistake that happens with immigrant populations who are not accustomed to seeing so many of these in yards. So this is a decomposer. Unlike a lot of decomposers, you actually find it growing on the ground. But it's decomposing, leaf litter and compost is sort of an advanced state of decomposition. But the nice thing about it is you'll very frequently not see them anywhere near trees, whereas your your edible parasol mushrooms, they tend to be in the woods more frequently. They are also decomposers, but they aren't as prone to growing in full sun out in the middle of nowhere. They also develop like sort of grayish green gills over time. That is the color of the spores. And sometimes they stain a little red, and they also have this scaly surface on top. So they're white and a little bit fluffy, like you can see on the edges. You'll pick up little bits of white material on your fingers when you handle them, but also a basically patch of brown scaly material as it opens up. It will leave these little scales here and there. They remind me of colored pencil shavings almost. That's another thing that also helped me determine between these and the edible parasols, is that the shags, or the scales on these, tend to come off very easily. But oftentimes it's more just a matter of size, stature, and location. Finally, my favorite thing about this mushroom is actually it has a double partial veil. So you have one like dark brown raggedy thing, and then a very neat white under surface, like a second ring, and they're conjoined. And I just love the appearance of it, because you can mess around with it and like move it up and down the stem, and it won't fall apart because it's got two pieces for you. And so that is a mushroom you'll see commonly. I guess I got one more for you, and then I'm going to release you into the wild. Areoboleta spatula, or the shaggy soft bolete. I promised I would talk to you about boletes, and here we are. So these are the mushrooms that have a spongy undersurface. A lot of them are big and fat, so if you're familiar with the porcini mushroom, we also have a lot of like porcini-like edible mushrooms around here that have, again, they're sort of like this and a big old fat cap. Areoboletus is one of my favorite genera in our area, and Areoboleta spatula is one of my favorite mushrooms in that genus. It has really prominent reticulation. Again, it's that sort of overlay of tissue on top of a stem that is sort of a candy red. That candy red is also reflected in the young mushrooms and the cap. As it ages, you can see, boletes do this all the time. They will start out one color and they turn a different color, and sometimes they stain. Like they're of the mushrooms that you're going to have difficulty like saying consistently what color it is. Boletes are going to be notoriously problematic. But that said, they're also really easy in this case to identify because they are so sort of tall, slender, with these really, really prominent shags of reticulation. You also have a giant chunk of mycelium at the base that is white. And when you harvest this mushroom, it's almost impossible to like harvest the entire thing without having like a very, very big sort of floofy knot of mycelium at the base of it. And that's kind of unusual, because a lot of mushrooms, you pluck them and you're like, oh, there's a little bit of the mycelium, I can see the color. And the final thing I'll say about this is edible, and it has a really nice citrusy sour flavor. So when I say edible, it is not edible in the sense like porcini is very like earthy, and some people describe it as meaty, but I find it's like earthy good is how I describe it, whereas this is much more like straight up citrus. I put it with dark greens and green beans. It's freaking amazing. You don't want to eat the cap. I mean, you can, but the consistency isn't great, so you just take the shags off the stem and cook it, and they're really nice. And I'm gonna finish with just a couple of my favorites. We have our indigo milky caps, really beautiful. Milky caps are really cool. I'm not gonna get into that. And then we also have, I started at the top of the hour with our red russula, which is impossible to identify, but wanted to finish with one of our quilted russulas, which is a group of russula mushrooms that are all edible, and they are all quilted to one degree or another. And when I say quilted, what I mean is they're sort of greenish, and you have, most of them are like green, gray, or this one is my favorite, which is Russula parvoviruscens, which is nothing to do with parvovirus, by the way. I was very, very confused by that scientific name, but it is known as the blue-green quilted Russula. So those are really good, and unlike a lot of your other russulas, they're considered really good in part because they have a nice flavor, but they also don't fall apart super easily. So if you collect one of these, you can actually you can handle it without it falling apart. And that is step one to determining russula edibility. Step two is whether or not it is spicy, and that's kind of as far as it goes. If it's too spicy to eat, you can't eat it. If it is mild, then you can, if you so choose. All right, so I have kept you long enough and babbled at you long enough. I really appreciate the time and welcome any questions you have. This is just a really important part of my life in the Piedmont. It's given me a great sense of appreciation for the diversity of our habitats coming from the West Coast, where I was like, oh, well, that's mushroom paradise. And I'm like, hang on a second, they have Doug fir plantations, and that's about it. And I land here, and I'm like, I've got 17 different types of oak, and so many different kinds of trees and plants. To that point, if you're interested in chanterelles, look out for places where you have oak trees and muscadine all over the place. That is if you see an oak grove with your little ground lying muscadine grape, that's where you want to go. And that is where you will hopefully find your chanterelles, but also a few hedgehog mushrooms if you're lucky, like I occasionally have. All right, well, thanks everybody. Any questions?
Do you need the teeth on the hedgehog when you cook them, or do you?
Oh, I don't remove the teeth. I do use a mushroom brush, and that often takes off a lot of them. My biggest concern with cleaning hedgehogs or any mushroom is to get rid of any grit. But I very rarely have to actually do much, like I can brush them off. And if they come off in the pan, they won't burn. They're so small, they just kind of disappear, which is why I'm like, it's not a concern for cooking, because they can just kind of fall apart, and they won't turn into two different things, texture-wise.
I also have a question how to eat some of the mushrooms.
Sure.
So how to eat Amanita Caesars? That's the first question. And the second one is the chicken of woods. I feel it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard when I cook them, even though I put in the soup or I use butter or oil to salt it.
Mm-hmm.
Salt it. It's still hard. So how do you eat these two mushrooms?
Yes, great questions. So for your Caesar mushrooms, I take the cap when it's nice and closed up, and I will just slice it very, very thin. And I put a little bit of sea salt and olive oil on it, and it's just a little treat. I also sometimes cook it in a pan, but this is one of those mushrooms that if you collect it and it is bug-free and very clean, that you can consume raw. And most people do cut it up very fine, so it's more like, again, it's more like a garnish or a snack than a main. And most people do prepare it they don't put much in the way of seasoning on it either, because it has some really nice flavors, but if you put any kind of herb on it, you might drown that out pretty easily. So that's But you can cook them also the way that you would saute any mushroom. Also the caps, when they're closed, they can be really good. If you like, you know, whole cap mushrooms in soup, they behave quite well in that sense. Like if you like patty straw mushrooms in your sweet and sour soup, which I do, they behave in a similar way. Like the cap will stick all together, so you have a whole mushroom to eat. Latiparus, your chicken of the woods, the reason that you find them to be a little too hard is because most likely you missed the ideal tenderness window by a day or two. So these mushrooms get very fibrous very, very fast. And if you cook them and you find them to be, like, if they are hard, there's no way to make them soft. They, again, won't harm you, but most of the time when I'm harvesting this mushroom, I will start by harvesting the outer growth zones, like right on the outside where it's the most white. And if it's nice and pliable, like really squishy, then it is good to eat. Once it starts to become at all stringy, it can be very difficult to enjoy from a texture and taste perspective. The other thing that I often do when I find one that's like this and the whole thing is edible, I'll chop it off at the base, and these mushrooms, when they're very fresh and in ideal condition, they drop a whole lot of whitish tinged water, and it will just soak your hand. If it is a large fruiting body like this is probably about 4 or 5 pounds. And so that for me is oftentimes, it's like, is it nice and pliable, but also if I cut it and it drops a lot of water immediately, then I get really excited. But yeah, it's probably, and when I say the window is short, the window it can be very, very, very short for like tasty and tender and not so tasty and no longer tender at all. Do you have a follow-up? Let's do a follow-up. Now let's hold your questions, the rest of you. I know you're all jumping up and down. Yeah, let's, you have a follow-up question.
Yeah, if other people don't ask, I still have questions.
Oh no, I think we're good for your follow-up question.
Oh, okay. So I also eat hand of woods.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see this issue on hand of woods. It's still very fruity, very meaty, and it's soft.
Yes.
For hand of woods.
Yes.
Oh, that's correct. Okay.
That is correct. Yes. And I should have included one, just given the time of year. So hen of the woods, Grifola frondosa. It looks very similar. It is more of a sort of brown with a little bit of a black rim, and also more feathery, like a lot more fingers. And to your point, if it is not like really dried out, it's starting to split, it will be typically tasty all the way through. Even ones that I find where they're very large and the base of them is kind of hard, I will make those into, they retain good flavor. So I'll put them in stock. Like even if you get, you know, a giant head of the woods and some of it feels a little too stiff, you can use it to flavor other things. So that one, unfortunately, my trees did not do their thing. They made little hens like this, and then they dried out and split up. So I didn't bring any pictures of them.
There's one over there that's really nice.
Oh, there we go. There we go. There's the real deal.
If anybody wants to take some home, they can, because I've already ate some this season.
That's a good one. And it similarly, like it's all the same sort of butt rot fungus grows with oak, especially very mature oak, and it comes back year after year after year. I also discovered that the North Carolina School for the Blind is crawling with them. And one time I went there and I'm like, oh, I want to make sure no one finds them. So I was covering them up with leaves, and I'm like, I think I'm getting a little paranoid about like protecting my mushroom spots if I'm trying to hide from blind children. Like, gotta bring that avarice in. All right, any other questions, comments, stories?
Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you all. I'm sorry to visit you in dry conditions, but hopefully next year it's fun. We're also over in the triangle. We're behind y'all by a ways, but we're gonna have a mushroom club soon as well. We have all kinds of people who are way more organized than me, so maybe we can come together and do some group forays, or at least compare notes and be friendly mushroom allies across the board.
Thank